Ahoy there, fellow travelers. Welcome to E-Travels with Trules, a personal and literary podcast of travel adventures and misadventures from around the world. This is Eric Trules, and thanks for listening. Welcome to another behind-the-scenes episode on the E-Travels with Trules podcast. I'm Eric Trules, and today I'll be talking with Christensen, the creator of the award-winning online travel site Amateur Traveler, which consists of 3 parts. First, the Amateur Traveler weekly audio podcast, which focuses primarily on travel destinations and the best places to travel. It covers everything from knowing what to put on your dog when you go to the windy city of Chicago to swimming with whales in Tonga. Second is the Amateur Traveler blog, which features travel photography, travel advice, and product reviews. And third is the Amateur Traveler video podcast, featuring videos shot on location at various travel destinations around the world. Chris created the Amateur Traveler podcast, which he hosts, in July of 2005, and he's released over 500 episodes since then. The show usually features an interview with a travel destination expert or with a traveler who has lived in or been to the destination recently. The show's intention is to motivate people to travel. Chris and the Amateur Traveler won a Lowell Thomas Award for travel journalism from the Society of American Travel Writers and a Smitty Award from Travel and Leisure magazine, which named Chris the best independent travel journalist of 2014. He is also the owner of bloggerbridge.com, which is a new startup connecting bloggers and industry contacts. He lives in San Jose, California, and works in the Silicon Valley by day as a software engineer, manager, and executive. Some of his passions are learning new things, language, and humor. I think I could talk to Chris for 3 days straight about all the things he's done and is doing, business and travel-wise. But let's get started. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. I was just glad I survived wasn't outlived by the intro there.
Well, it's a mighty impressive resume and career in podcasting. I think you were there at the beginning.
Well, the funny thing is, I wasn't quite at the beginning. I was there within the first year, but when I started, I thought I was late.
That must say something about your personality.
Well, it probably does, yes.
Why don't we start with you telling us about where you're from, how you started traveling, and when and why you started your travel podcast?
Sure. Well, I actually was born in Ohio, but don't remember. It came out as a young child to California. So I live in California. I grew up in the more agricultural part of California, Salinas Valley. Went to the same high school as John Steinbeck, although not at the same time, I should point out. And my travels as a child were to national parks in the West with my parents. It was a lot of road trips, not a lot of airplane trips. I think by the time I graduated college and was already married for a couple of years, the only place I'd been outside the U.S. was Canada. So I've done a lot of my traveling later than some of my travel blog colleagues.
You know what I read on your voluminous, multi-layered travel site? That you listen to, I think, 50 to 70 podcasts, and you're interested in storytelling. And when you got together with your friends, most of those stories seem to be about travel, and that's how you decided to do a travel podcast.
Yeah. So when podcasting started, I decided I liked podcasting and wanted to do one. And I thought about a number of different things. I thought about tech because I'm a high-tech Silicon Valley startup kind of guy. I thought about actually a religious show, which I actually do one of those now. But we had a Labor Day picnic. And as you say, all the best stories were travel stories. And that was like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this. Although I thought at the time, so you're starting your show now or few episodes in, I thought I was going to be doing something about my personal travels.
Yeah,
that was the original plan.
Yeah.
I've got a few stories. I've been traveling to a few places, but of course I was full-time employed at the time. And so I was traveling 4 weeks a year and I was podcasting 48 weeks a year, and that math did not work. I was rapidly burning through stories. And then a friend of mine, I think it was his first cruise, and he came on the show and I interviewed him, and I really liked that. I found that I actually enjoyed the interview format because then I was hearing somebody else's travel stories. I was hearing the stories that I didn't know and hearing about places that I hadn't seen. And so the story, basically by the time the show got to episode, 20 or something like that, I'd have to go back and look, it had changed more into what it is today, which is, as you say, focusing on destinations and largely focusing on other people's stories. Although I travel a lot more now than I did in those days, so my stories get in there as well.
Well, let's see what happens with my episode 20, because I'm only on,
Yeah.
I'm only on 7 or 8 now. And
Right.
I'm a storyteller. I come from the theater. I've done a lot of these stories and many other monologues over many years. So I think I have a huge backlog of travel stories. But and because I've chosen the format and the style that I've chosen, which is sound immersive, it takes me a long time to score each story. I have original music and sound design, so I'm actually releasing new travelogues only once a month. My producer, Harry Duran, said that's not frequently enough for a podcast. You got to do something else. So what I've come up with are these behind the scenes interviews with people like yourself, starting first with my own team. And it is what you say. It is a different species, and it's interesting to get to hear other people and what they're doing and how they feel about travel. I've come up with something called the Trules Travel Quiz, which you must take by the end of the interview.
I don't remember hearing that in your episodes. Okay, so see if it sounds familiar after we do that. Okay.
Nothing to worry about.
I would have studied, but
nothing to study for. It's all spontaneous. I teach improvisation. And of course, that's what travel is, isn't it? It's being able to respond to the cues that travel throws your way, the people you meet and the upset stomachs and the broken down transportation and all these things that you can't predict or plan for.
Yeah, well, you talked about me being someone who loves to learn. That's one of the reasons I love travel is it's a puzzle. When you're standing there in front of the subway ticket machine and it's all in Czech and you don't speak a word of Czech and you're trying to figure out what buttons do I press in what order to do, to accomplish the goal. It's like going to one of those puzzle rooms they have these days and seeing if you can get to where you need to go. And that's one of the reasons I like it.
I understand. Hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to read something from your website. It's your travel manifesto, which I like a lot. I won't read it all, but I'll read your setup and a few of the your goals and desires. This is what Chris has written on the Amateur Traveler. When I chose the name Amateur Traveler for the podcast that I create each week, I had in mind the word amateur in its most classic definition, which means to do something for the love of doing it rather than for pay. I have never been opposed to being paid to travel or to write or talk about travel, but even now as that happens more regularly, I don't want to forget what I want this site to be about. As an amateur traveler, it is my desire and goal to never lose my sense of wonder and adventure when I'm traveling. Never complain that we don't do things that way at home. That's part of the point of traveling. Never whine, because in the grand scheme of things, if I can afford to travel, what have I got to complain about? Pack light, because sometimes the best part of a vacation is what we leave behind. And this is the last one I'll stop with. Treat the airport security people with kindness, because I am getting on the plane and they are not. I think that's very insightful, astute, and generous of you.
Well, thank you. I thought it sounded pretty good. I don't remember writing it.
Actually,
it's been a while.
Actually, there are about 10 more.
Yeah.
Here are 2 more that pop out at me, and then I'll stop with your manifesto. Try to speak at least a few words of the local language because it shows respect. And smile as I botch the local language because humility is not a bad thing to learn either. I remember going many places and speaking very poor pidgin French or Spanish. All the Romance languages are, you're right, you can put a fantastico or a fantastica, and it sounds a lot like English. But, in some places they're not that friendly to Americans, or they have a reputation not to be that friendly. But, of course, I think one of the reasons to travel is that you find out that people are people. So I often act dumb and humble and say in French, Je suis un stupide Américain, je parle seulement un petit peu de français. I'm a stupid American. I only speak a little French. And that usually gets them smiling and laughing. And I've tried. And then usually, of course, they speak much better English than I speak French. And that's true in most languages.
But sometimes they're not willing to do that if you're not willing to make a fool of yourself first, or at least it greases the wheels a bit.
Yeah.
The only trouble is that when you say it so well that they don't believe you, and really the only phrase you remember is "Ya понимаю по-русски не очень хорошо," and then they're off in Russian, and you're like, no, really, that was all I know is I don't speak.
That's right.
Russian very well.
That's just the part I said in French, the part I rehearsed and memorized.
Exactly.
Here's something else that you do that I sort of knew about that was reminded by me. I was reminded of on your site. This Week in Travel is yet another podcast that you do with Jen Leo and Gary Arndt. A little less frequently or irregularly.
Right. It's not every week in travel. We try and make it very clear that we never promised somebody that it's this week in travel.
And Jen writes for the LA Times, still does or did. And
she just still does.
And Gary?
Gary is another straight to the web kind of travel journalist. So I won the Smitty Award for Travel and Leisure in 2014. He won it in 2013. So he won it the year before me, the first year they did it. He's best known for his photography. So he has become an award-winning photographer, which he wasn't when he headed out on the road. He was somebody who sold his software company and started traveling full-time and then learned to become a good photographer. Well, I thought he was a good photographer when he headed out. He wasn't a bad photographer, but he's learned to become a award-winning photographer.
That's cool. I went to this year's and a few others, but to the LA Travel and Adventure show.
Yeah, sure.
And I was surprised that there was no podcast presence, very little photography presence. Everybody was selling their tour or their location. And
sure.
I thought somebody should have a podcast presence there, because it's sort of a big thing, certainly podcasting and now travel podcasting. There's a lot of different sites, don't you think?
It's still a relatively, travel is such a big industry.
Yeah.
There's such a huge amount of money that goes into travel. There's so many big companies, so many people spend so much on travel that, travel podcasting, even travel blogging is still a relatively small thing within a very large industry. We've done some things. We've actually done This Week in Travel show from that show before. Including some of the people who headline that show have been on This Week in Travel. So Samantha Brown and Johnny Jett and some of the usual speakers who they have at those kinds of shows have been on. But yeah, it's not something I think that most travelers even know anything about travel podcasts. So there's still room for growth.
Admitting my age on the air, I think I've done several times, but people from my generation, they don't know the difference between a blog and a podcast. And I had my launch party at my home with a bunch of people my age, and we had to hold their hands on their iPhones to try to find the iTunes site. It took it took a long time,
Well, see, you have it comparatively easy. 12 years ago, or 13 and a half years ago is when I started. You had to hold their hand on the iPod, and well, it didn't get on the iPod unless you went to the computer and hooked your, downloaded to your computer and then synced it. And it just got. My wife didn't listen to podcasts of any type for probably the first 7 years that I was podcasting, maybe 10 years even, and then she started doing a longer commute, and she said, well, she's not an audio learner. No, she's just not an audio. She's a visual learner. Podcasts are not for her. But, when the day of the smartphones came, it became so much easier that I said, well, why don't you try a few? And I downloaded a few that I thought she would enjoy. And of course, now so often she comes home and said, did you hear what they said on the recent Freakonomics podcast? Or did you hear? She doesn't listen to my podcast, you understand? But she listens to a number of podcasts and enjoys what she didn't think she would enjoy. Didn't think that was a way she could learn.
I'm afraid I can relate to that. My wife is from Indonesia and quite a few years younger than me. And about 6 months ago, I introduced her to Audible. And and now she is committed to listening to 200 books a year, which I think is incredible.
My.
But she's soaking up all this information and self-help stuff, and she's just listening all the time. It's incredible and impressive and easy for her. And I've created an audio vampire in the best sense of the word.
Well, yeah, audiobooks are what I do when I run out of the 70 to 90 podcasts that I listen to. When I listen to all of the episodes that are available, then I fall back to audiobooks. And my family, my adult children, and my wife and I have a reading goal for this year. We picked out 12 different challenges: reading a book that wasn't written in English, reading a book that was banned at one time, reading a book that is in an area you didn't know, and came up with kind of different ways of encouraging us to read outside our usual boundaries. And I'm making progress. I'm ahead of schedule. I've listened to, I think, 3 that I could check off there, and other books that were in my regular genre that I couldn't usually just check off from my reading challenge for the year. So
I don't know if you know this about me, but my wife and I just adopted our 9-year-old nephew from Indonesia, and he's been here almost 2 years. He came with speaking almost zero English, as my wife did. So I have literally, and every morning before he goes to school, after I dress him and feed him breakfast, we read from like a 9-year-old or more like a 6-year-old reader to learn English, and knowing that that's one of the most important things you can offer a child, right? Is the gift of language and being able to read, and the excitement of what's in books and now podcasts.
One of the things that we do that is not exactly the same as that, but we do hosting for Airbnb. And this year we have a young man from China and his mother, and he is here to study English for a year. And so Nick, which is his English name, obviously not his Chinese name, will, we get up in the morning and wish people, Cao Sheng Hao. And then, I largely run out of Chinese at that point, but we get to answer a lot of his questions as he's trying to figure out what things mean and such, because he's still in a beginner's level. I mean, he's further ahead than your adopted son in terms of his English, but he is still learning a lot. Still at that.
After a year and a half, though, my kid knows more idioms than I do. He's just learned. He's just learned from
at that age.
Yeah, he's just learned from all the kids at school, plus all the videos and games he watches. And are you a parent?
Yeah, I have 2 adult kids.
But in these days, you have to be very careful about how much electronics you're feeding your child, because they can get completely addicted and lost and forget about playing real games.
Yeah. Well, my son, who is actually also a podcaster, one of the 2 podcasts he does is about games. So he does another one on comics. But
one of the things that interests me and impresses me most about you is your programmer, Silicon Valley business acumen, knowledge, experience, and how you've made your site into a multi-level, deep site of interaction for the audience and customers and podcasters and readers. My guess is it's part of your DNA.
Well, yes, it is. It is to this day how I make a living, and also something that I greatly enjoy is all the all the geek stuff. I'm a nerd. There's just no question about it. I've worked for IBM and Apple and 18 years in Silicon Valley startup companies, and I'm a nerd. So it is something that I enjoy doing as well.
You've been able to articulate it and offer, like I say, a deep menu of ways to spend a lot of time on your site.
Well, you'll see where you are at 550 episodes and 220 episodes of the other show. So whatever, 770 episodes. Your site will look a little different too. And if you go back into the Internet Wayback Machine, I don't know if you know this website, you can go back and see older versions of sites. Please don't go look at older versions of amateurtraveler.com because, 12 years ago, websites were pretty darn ugly.
Yeah, I had a travel website. It was, I still think it's cool because it has so many interesting original graphics, but I show it to my students at USC or my producer and they sort of laugh at it. They think it looks 1990,
Yep, exactly. I've been there, done that. Yeah, no, I started doing web development right around then. Well, that was a little early for web development, but I went to my first web company in 96. So started programming on the internet in 94.
That's interesting that you did web development, and that's part of the Silicon Valley thing that you do, right?
Yeah, that's what I've been doing since then. Started doing it at Apple. I was in Apple's online services when I was there. So there's that stream to me as well.
I think you said, I read, that one day you'll do a podcast about stories told to you by your father, about when your grandfather was in the bank when it was robbed.
Yes. Well, the timer's running out on that one. I don't know if I'm ever going to get around to it. And Dad is now 90. Still a good storyteller, but I better capture those stories sooner than later. Yeah, I am a storyteller from a family of storytellers. My grandfather was a storyteller. He's no longer with us. Died in '89. But the particular story you're talking about, he lived in Brush, Colorado. You've seen Colorado. You've seen all the postcard pictures of all the mountains and things like that. He didn't live in that part. He lived in the flat part. Out there as a cowboy. He was on the last roundup in Colorado when he was 16 years old. So he saw Colorado from when they put up the fences and lived to see, men on the moon and the internet and things like that. Or at least email, and not quite the web. But he went into the bank one time and said, as nobody was there, he said, "Does somebody help me?" And somebody said, "We'll be with you in a minute." And somebody stuck a gun in his ribs, and he had walked into the middle of a bank robbery. And it was a very memorable experience for him because the guy who was robbing the bank, who had his gun on my grandfather, was very nervous. And so he was shaking the whole time. This gun was shaking as he was staring down the barrel of it.
That would make me nervous, a shaking gun in my ribs.
They actually backed them into the vault to, make their getaway. We're going to lock you in the vault, and then we're going to do our getaway. And when they slammed the vault door, the alarm went off, and he thought he was shot for a second. And then to show how old this story is, and I don't understand this next part, but they had left the back door of the vault open, and I don't know why a vault needs a back door, but this one had one. It wasn't a safe; it was a secure room, and so they jumped out and got on their horses to go take off after these guys. He said, "I don't know what we were doing. They had guns and we didn't. It was a very stupid plan, and they were sort of fortunate that they didn't catch the guys." But the robbers had actually had a pretty decent plan. They went to a basement just a few doors over and changed into overalls and, didn't have their masks on anymore. He couldn't identify the guy who had a gun who was, literally poking in his ribs. But they just mingled in the crowd and drifted away. But they later got caught because they were bragging about it. So not quite as smart as they thought.
Well, believe it or not, this coincidentally reminds me of my most recent story that I'm adopting for the travel podcast. It's about a trip I made to Deadwood, South Dakota in 1970.
Okay. Yeah,
doing the most patriotic thing I'd ever done in my life, going to see Mount Rushmore. The problem was it was near sunset, so I was trying to get there really fast, and there was a little green hornet in front of me, and I passed it. Maybe there was a white line or yellow line, but Ma and Pa Kettle were in that green hornet. They telephoned Deadwood Dick McGrath, the sheriff in Deadwood, South Dakota, and Sheriff Deadwood Dick McGrath came 20 miles out of town and brought me back into town and locked me in jail in Wild Bill Hickok's jail in Deadwood, South Dakota. And I had to see the judge who said, made me plead guilty or not. And I said, listen, Judge, I just want to get out of jail as soon as possible. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was going to guilty or not, son. I said, not guilty. He banged his gavel and he told me I had to stay in jail under bail or bond for the next 6 months because there wasn't a trial date. This was in September, the same day that Jimi Hendrix was overdosed on and died. And I was led into the day room in this Deadwood, South Dakota jail with all these mostly Indians and half redneck white guys. And they're all looking at the TV with Hendrix and his long hair. And they're yelling at the TV, faggot, and worse words, and long hair, hippie, faggot. And then they look up at me, and my hair is have a giant Jufro. And I realized I was going to be in trouble for a while. but I was impressed that I was in Wild Bill Hickok's jail. So,
and for the young people listening, when he says they called the sheriff, you have to understand they stopped the car at a phone and called the sheriff because we didn't have phones in those days. But
that's true. We didn't have.
Ask your parents; they'll explain it to you. So,
what about your audience? I think you have demographics and charts. Is it mostly mixed, or what age range does your travel podcast reach?
It's fairly broad age range. It's a relatively flat demographic, not as many teens, a very small number of teens, and then really starting with 20 and going, it's kind of a flat curve from 20 to 65 or so. And then we do have some people who are retired travelers who are listening, and even some who are, from emails I get, who are post-travel but are still listening to travel vicariously. But predominantly it's people who are planning the next trip. I had one person who wrote me last year, and said they were planning a trip to Europe, and they had downloaded 50 episodes of The Amateur Traveler to listen to them. And I was doing the math because we were running transcripts of all the episodes at that time, and the average transcript was 7,000 to 10,000 words. So I was doing the math at 50 episodes, 7,000 words, 350,000 words. To plan their trip, that's roughly the equivalent of about the third Harry Potter book.
They must have been well prepared.
Well, and what happens with, as your listeners know, we don't have to tell them, what happens with podcasts is you fit it in the cracks in your life. You're listening to it in the car on the way to work. The number of people who tell me that they're listening to it in the walk in the evening around walking the dog or working out or something like that, you have a lot of time that you can listen to it. So, especially for those of us who listen at double speed, it goes through a little faster, but that's still a lot of words.
I haven't even tried that yet, double speed. But I went to the LA Podcast Festival now at the Sofitel Hotel in Beverly Hills. And I'm standing on a drink line next to a woman, sort of a hip-looking woman who I figured was a podcaster herself. I asked her, "Are you a podcaster?" "No, I'm a fan." I said, "Well, when do you listen to podcasts?" She says, "At work. As I do my data entry, I listen to a lot of podcasts, hours and hours a day." And I think that's a large part of the audience out there. They do have time. Yeah.
Well, I listen sometimes at work. Depends what I'm doing. I can't. When I'm really coding, I can't listen because at that point I really need to concentrate. But if I'm just doing email and some of those things, I can. I had someone who wrote in, was catching up on all the old shows, and was getting ready to retire as someone who worked in the post office sorting mail. And so it was a fairly routine.
Yes, that's the kind of job. Yeah.
She was basically crediting the show with keeping her sane, and so we have one less disgruntled postal employee because of the amateur traveler. So that's maybe my small contribution to society. So
yeah, that's the person I met at the podcast fest.
Exactly.
I listened
Actually,
to your
the weirdest thing for that. You talked about, we had that long intro of all the things going on with amateur travel. The weirdest story, I don't know, is that you heard. If you go to get a job with the Thailand Foreign Ministry, so their version of the State Department, you have to take an English proficiency exam. You'll be required to listen to 2 episodes of The Amateur Traveler and will be graded on your understanding of them as part of that exam.
That's your equivalent to professorship.
Well, actually, the Amateur Traveler, by the time that they asked permission last summer, I guess that was 2014, the Amateur Traveler was already used to teach English as a foreign language in Oxford, in the Canadian school system, the German school system, and a couple other universities. But this was the strangest one because the 2 episodes that you have to listen to, one is on narrowboating in England and Wales, and the other one is on Yorkshire in England, and I don't know why they picked them. They said, could we have permission to use these 2 particular episodes of The Amateur Traveler for our test? I thought, why? Okay, sure. It's not anything to do with Thailand. Well, of course, I suppose if they picked something with Thailand, you may know more information, so you may understand it better. So they probably picked something that had an American guest and one with a British guest, so you'd have 2 different accents. But
that makes sense.
Just bizarre.
My last behind the scenes I did with a guy, I think you might have been on his show, Hayden Lee from the Travel Stories podcast. You know him? No,
I don't really know Hayden.
He's in Shropshire, England, and I thought he mentioned you, but maybe not. I could be mistaken, but
we might have met, and I apologize, Hayden, if you're listening. I meet a lot of people in this, and so I may have forgotten him.
How did you see your show grow from not very proudly produced to having so many listeners? Was it technique or persistency or perseverance?
Persistence.
I think I mean
perseverance. Yeah. There's no one thing. There absolutely isn't any one thing that I did right that caused the numbers to change overnight. I remember when I was where you were, plus another 10, 20, 30 episodes, I was getting 200 downloads per episode. And I remember being pretty darn happy about 200 downloads per episode, that was pretty cool, because that's 200 people who didn't know me who were listening to my podcast. And it just kind of kept going from there. And obviously podcasting itself has grown so much. There are so many more people listening to podcasts than there were when I was getting started. I got started before iTunes and introduced podcasting by a few episodes. Yeah. And so it was pretty obscure at that point, and it has died at least a couple times, I'm told, since then, although not really, just in the press. The press has written about the death of podcasting on multiple different occasions.
It seems to be booming now. Everyone's talking about monetizing, right? And sponsorship.
Some of us were talking about monetizing in 2005. It's just a little more practical now. But yeah, I mean, there are some things that I did right. Like, I do a lot of promotion of the show. Every time we have an episode, I try and let the tourism board know. I try and let the world know. I spend about an hour putting out different tweets and Facebook updates and Instagram updates and Pinterest updates and all of those things.
Sounds familiar.
Which we didn't have when I got started, right? There was no way to, you didn't put it out on social media. We didn't have social media, right?
Yeah.
We only had a social media. And then also I do some things where I've been on other people's shows. This is definitely one of the ways that you meet other people who have audience their audience. So you always say yes when invited.
Yeah.
But and then I do one of the things that's helped over the last year actually is there's a popular tech show, the Daily Tech News Show, from somebody down in your area, Tom Merritt, who has a very large audience, and I do a weekly segment for him on travel, just a minute-long tech and travel update for his audience, talking about this app or that law or something else that ties the two together, and that's helped in terms of exposure. And have been on a number of podcasters. Obviously, I know a lot of the travel podcasters, at least those of us who are veterans.
Yeah.
There's always new ones starting, but
yeah, it sounds incremental and from
very
200
incremental
to many thousands in many ways. People get to know you by word of mouth and other shows, and
now we're at a range of somewhere in the 4,000 to 4,500 downloads a day. So that's not the biggest show out there in terms of podcasts. The biggest show out there is the Hardcore History podcast that does millions per episode. But for the rest of us, that puts me somewhere in the 90 to 95th percentile for podcasts. So that's not too bad.
It's pretty damn good. Have you heard about this new podcast, I think, network, Wondery?
I haven't heard about that one, but I have seen lots of networks come and go over the years. So I always look at those with a little bit of
skepticism.
Let's say that's it, because a lot of the people who come into the area really don't bother talking to podcasters first and really don't know the space as well as they think they do. So we're definitely going to see more of those come and go. I've been on 2 different podcast networks that have gone under. One that went under in 2006 right away, and then one that dumped all their audio podcasts later. That was the biggest thing in podcasting there for a while. Pod Show. So
this guy comes from Fox Television, and he seems to be doing well so far. So I wish him well. But for a new podcaster like myself, although I've been a storyteller for so long, it seems like I need a few 100,000 downloads to interest anybody other than my listeners.
Yeah, usually in terms of monetization, what a lot of advertisers are looking for is about 5,000 downloads per episode before they're interested. That's kind of the entry level for monetization these days, according to what I hear from Libsyn, which is where I host and also the largest podcast network.
And my show's on Libsyn as well.
Yeah.
I see even on your blogger bridge, which connects bloggers with potential employers or the network of people who are interested in bloggers, you record Google Analytics, and I guess the sponsor advertiser has every right to know how many people are listening.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Anything on the tip of your travel tongue? Place? I know your most recent show was on Tokyo with.
Yep.
I've traded emails with Jason Andrew Jenkins from An Epic Education, because he travels with his kids, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the most recent show. The most recent travel I have done, it was in Baja California, going down to see the whales and the dolphins and swimming with sea lions on an uncruise in the Sea of Cortez. And the next trip is next Friday. I'm going to speak at a blogging conference, TBEX, the Travel Blog Exchange conference in Jerusalem.
Oh, nice. I've just recently discovered the TBEX, but it seems like a giant organization that has a lot of participants.
Well, not that giant. This particular conference, I would guess, is going to be one of the smaller ones, just because I think Israel's a little more challenging for some people. They're not quite as adventurous as that, and it's not as near. So I think there'll be probably less than 500 attendees at this one. The largest one they've had about 1,200, 1,300.
I wish you luck there. And perhaps it's time for the Trules Travel Quiz.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay.
42.
Okay. Where were you born?
I was born in Ohio, near Akron, Ohio.
Where are you from?
Well, if I say where I was from, I'd say Salinas, California. That's what's home to me.
And where do you call home?
San Jose, California, Silicon Valley.
There you go. What's your favorite place in the world?
You can't do this without getting asked that, and I still don't have a good answer for that. My top three that I usually think of are Egypt was just fabulous in terms of trips. A top place is actually the U.S. I'm a real fan of this particular country and some of the places we have there, but in terms of trips, Egypt and Istanbul and Tanzania really stand out for me.
I haven't been to Tanzania, but I've been to the other places. What do you think it means to be a traveler?
That you get up and move from one place to another. There is no agreement on what travel style is the right style. And I tend to be as apolitical as possible in that, as long as you're not doing damage to the places you're being in. You heard my manifesto. There is a style of travel that I think is a better style, at least better for me, and that is getting to know the place that you're going to for being another place. Trying to get past the language barrier to get to know the locals a little more, learning from the differences rather than regretting that they don't have free refills on the Diet Coke or something that you miss from home.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sort of an unplanned traveler. I try not to book hotels and know where I'm going to. I just try to book the first landing and maybe stay in a nice hotel for one night, and then I make it up as I go with the intention of discovering where I'm at, the people and the dance and the culture. I've been an artist for a long time, so all those things interest me, because although we dance and speak and eat differently, I think it's our humanity that connects us all, and we see how much we all really have in common. And I think somehow insulating yourself in the Sheraton or the Hilton and it doesn't do that for yourself. You're sticking to your American myopia.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I do a little more travel planning than you do, I think it sounds like. There. We've done those trips, but then we've also, had those trips end up being, now we're in Germany and we're staying above the beer hall and it's Pinksterfest and there's loud drunken Germans till 3 a.m. and we're trying to get some sleep because we have to drive to the airport and home the next day. So some of those unplanned trips could have used a little more planning.
Well, I guess I'll have to admit, now that I've been married and my wife is a little more fond of the comfortable hotels than the long houses where I like to stay. Sometimes I'm a little more comfortable. I travel a little more comfortably. Back to the quiz. What's one place you've always wanted to go where you've never been? And just one. Well,
this next trip, Jerusalem and Israel, is easily on that list. It's been a place I wanted to go to for many years, and so it's terrific to finally get there. And actually, I'm taking a group to India in November, and that is another place that is on my list of places to go to. And we'll just be scratching the surface. I mean, how much time could you spend in India before you felt like you'd seen it? But at least it will have started that journey. So
yeah,
I'm looking forward to that as
places like a subcontinent of India is like the United States or China or Russia. You can just keep traveling for the rest of your life. And of course, that's what's interesting about travel. No matter how many places you go, you've only touched a fraction of places that are possible, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What's your favorite city? Why?
I'm gonna come back to Istanbul because and I'm a little sad with what's going on in Turkey right now. I'm a little uneasy about the direction that country's going, but I am a huge history buff. I'm listening for recreation right now to what could easily be a textbook on the history of the Middle Ages, because I think that sort of thing is fun, which I understand that may not be to everyone. So when you're in a place that has such depth of history like Istanbul, which is still there. That you're not just talking about ruins, you're talking about Hagia Sophia that you can walk into, or you can walk the walls of Theodosius that guarded the city for 1,000 years starting in the 400s. It's just amazing for me.
And it's the very place where East met West, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, still does.
Yes. Yeah, I love it too. I found the people in Istanbul very friendly. They weren't dependent on you being a tourist. They welcomed you there, but if you go to Cuba or poor nations, they very much have to cater to your needs. This was being welcome in a cosmopolitan city. That's what I loved about Istanbul.
Well, I had a very different welcome because we had hosted a Turkish exchange student for most of the year, and I met him, and his friend who was studying at an English-speaking university was our tour guide for one day. So a very different view of Istanbul than I would have had otherwise.
Yeah, that's a nice way to see the city by a local person. If you're not totally booked in Jerusalem, I'd love to give you a friend's name who will give you a very nice look at Jerusalem.
I'll take that name.
All right. Not over the air, but right after the interview. What's your favorite park or non-urban place? Why?
Bryce Canyon National Park. Just a stunningly beautiful place. Walking down at just shortly after dawn, you've seen the sunrise, and then you walk down into the Navajo Creek Trail down into Wall Street with the big hoodoos towering either side over you. Just a beautiful, beautiful place.
I can see it. What's your favorite mode of transportation?
I love a good road trip. We were going down to Phoenix to see some friends last year, and I hadn't done a road trip in a while, and it was one of those, I've got an airline ticket. I'm actually going to get my money back, or at least get credit for it on Southwest, and just drive down there because I hadn't had a good road trip in a while. And every once in a while I crave a big road trip. Stopped at Joshua Trees National Monument. Great time.
I get that. Who do you like to travel with?
Either by myself or with the woman that I married 35 years ago. We still like traveling together. And it's a mixture of the two. It really is. Sometimes I like to go off by myself, and sometimes I love to go with her or with our adult kids now. Are great fun. Great fun to travel with.
They say it's a test to travel 24/7 with somebody.
We've gotten better. One of the things that I had to learn was that when I travel with her, I travel at half speed. that I literally have to try and tell myself to see half as much, because I will enjoy it twice as much if I don't drag her along at the speed that I would do by myself.
I have to go to a place with a good shower for my wife. that's my compromise.
I came back. You're talking about Tanzania. I came back from Tanzania, and I was supposed to be the advanced party. I was going to tell her how easy Tanzania was, and I come back. Oh, it was easy. I slept in a bed every night. I always had a hot shower every morning. Granted, sometimes it was a bucket shower, and that was it for her. It's like, okay, crossed it off her list.
Two forks diverged in the road. Which way would you go? Why?
I'd take the one less traveled by because it's a great poem. But and if that didn't work, I'd flip a coin because probably either one would be a great adventure. So,
last question: where will you go when you die?
Well, did I mention I also do a religious show? So
you could go on for that one.
I'm hoping there's a more definitive answer than that I'll be this year, this day in paradise sort of thing. But
that's a good answer. Okay.
And now, where will it look like? Probably Hawaii, but
let's hope so. Okay, thanks for being on the show, Chris. I hope my listeners have enjoyed your travel musings, your podcast expertise, and the breadth of your Amateur Traveler website, which they can find at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to thank my audience for listening, to remind them to subscribe on iTunes, to rate and review the show, to tell all their friends about the podcast. Please contact me about anything at erictrules.com. Until next time, happy trails. Original music composed by Amanda Yamate, sound designed by Alicia Bermudez. Produced by Harry Duran at Fullcast. Please contact us with your feedback and to schedule an on-air interview. This podcast has been supported with the USC Capstone Grants. Special thanks to Phil Allen and the School of Dramatic Arts for their support.